Okay, thank you for joining us, everyone. Today we're going to discuss how nonprofits can protect themselves in the event of a cyber attack. Please note that slides and the recording of today's presentation will be emailed to you tomorrow. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see several widgets for your use during the presentation. If you have a question, please click the purple Q&A icon to the left. At the end of the session, we would love for you to complete our brief survey by using the teal webinar feedback widget to the right. Speaking today are Nick Pearson from Evolve, a cyber liability insurance provider, which is based in Philadelphia. He is joined by Mr. Ashley Burden, a claims adjuster at CFC Underwriting out of London, and Wendy Caruso from Corporate Synergies, which is a national insurance brokerage and consultancy. So you have lots of experts sharing their knowledge and experience with you today. At this time, I will turn it over to Nick.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for joining on this. As Dina mentioned at the end, we'll open it up to questions at the end. But hopefully this will bring some knowledge to the cyber liability sector for nonprofits specifically. First question is kind of what is cyber liability? In short, it's coverage for your intangible assets. Now previously, as you can see on the left side of the screen there, it was all in filing cabinets. You had papers, paper upon papers upon papers. Now this is kind of a good example of the data that we're living and carrying around with us daily. 128 gigabyte iPhone or cell phone for that matter equals 10,000 filing cabinets. So we can store a lot more data within a smaller period these days within the cloud and everything. So that just brings hackers and cyber attacks becoming more and more, why we see more and more coming for that side of things, because we can carry so much more with it, among us for that matter. So there are I'm going to go over just some common misconceptions about cyber policies and cyber insurance for that matter that we see in the marketplace on a daily basis. One of the first common misconceptions that we see is cyber insurance is only required for technology companies. Now that they require cyber insurance, but they also require a separate E&O, errors and omissions insurance technology form as well. Now, what you see in this side of things, nonprofits and all businesses are exposed to cyber attacks in these areas as well. Another common misconception that we see is cyber insurance only is required for companies with mobile apps. That among them, mobile apps require cyber insurance, but there are many more areas where you need cyber insurance as well. One more common misconception that we see is just cyber insurance is only required for companies with websites. Not all companies have websites, but they are still exposed, which I'll touch on a little bit later, to personal identifiable information, PCI areas, which is payment card industry side of things, and protected health information as well, among many others. Claims only happen to large companies, Fortune 500 companies, the Targets of the world, the Home Depots of the world. Now, these are the ones that get the most pub in terms of these areas, but what we see from a claims side of things that don't get on the news as much, the amount of claims that roll in are really geared towards, and the targets, because the resources aren't there, are to those small and medium-sized companies as well. And without the resources, these attacks affect them a lot more than a Fortune 500 company, because they don't have the disposable income, essentially, if they are hit with a cyber attack. Another common misconception is cyber is expensive. Essentially, it's just an additional cost that previously didn't have to be paid through a cyber insurance policy. Now these are getting more and more required in these areas from a third party and a first party perspective as well, because cyber insurance is so relatively new in terms of other policies. This is kind of the time that cyber needs to be placed in these areas, because it's the softest or the cheapest the market essentially will be, because those claims haven't rolled in, because full standalone policies as well as bolt-on policies have not been purchased in their full effect. Cyber applies to every type of business in every industry, period. Now, I know this is nonprofit specific, but this we're seeing more and more in the nonprofit space. But the main point that I'm trying to get across here is every industry, every business, whether you're a nonprofit, whether you're a healthcare organization, from that side of things, some sort of cyber policy is required in these areas. Every nonprofit and business in this webinar does all 4 of these things in some capacity. They collect sensitive data, relies on some sort of technology, whether it be in-house or third party, performs some sort of financial transactions, whether it be through a bank, whether it be through some sort of payment side of things, whether it be some sort of Social Security side of things as well. Number 4, every business is exposed and potentially vulnerable to being hit and can't stop 100% hackers in these areas as well. Now I'm going to touch on, and we're going to touch on some claims examples. I'm going to bring in Ash as well in some of these slides just to go over some claims examples when I go through these areas of essentially the 3 areas where exposed information every business kind of has during these. So the 3 types it can be broken into 3 buckets essentially for exposed information. PII, which is short for personally identifiable information. I will touch on this on the next slide and go in a little bit deeper, but think your personal information, your Social Security numbers. PCI, payment card information from this. Any company that takes any sort of credit card within this area, whether it be for donations, whether it be for paying for a service of some sort as well, the payment card information is an area where there is exposed information as well. And last but not least is protected health information. This is really geared towards the health industry in this, but there are some nonprofits that focus on health information as well, and every business in some capacity is exposed in the protected health information with health insurance and along those side of things in some capacity. So I'm going to touch on all 3 of these, and Ash at the end of each one will kind of touch on a specific claims example so you can get a real-life example of where this is covered. PII, personal identifiable information, as I mentioned. These vary by state, but essentially the California definition of PII in this area is typically can be used for most of the states in this. So it's any piece of information that can be linked back to one individual within this. So common examples of PII is your name, your date of birth, your address, your email address, your username, your Social Security number, and your bank account details. Now the expensive ones that come and the hackers are obviously targeting are really geared towards that Social Security number and the bank account details as well, which cause financial loss for individuals as well. So additional costs of the loss as well, which fall into these areas which you'd hope that your cyber policy would cover in this areas as well, is the legal costs allocated when said breach occurs and Social Security numbers are issued. So some of those that fall into that is the notification costs. So within that, even if when a insured, said nonprofit, is hit with a breach, you have to notify each one of your customers and your employees and any capacity that they could potentially be vulnerable to a said breach. And these costs essentially can be anywhere from $1 to $3 per person. So you can multiply that by the number of patrons that you have within that. And that, if you're not covered, is a net loss essentially that you have to pay out within those individuals as well. Reputational harm is another piece where essentially if a nonprofit is hit with a said cyber breach and attack in terms of those areas, and you have to notify each one of these individuals. You have to provide credit monitoring for each one of these individuals. The reputation for your brand essentially can be hurt within that area, and you could lose customers due to said data breach as well. So you would hope on the first party side of things that your cyber policy would cover reputational harm as well. This as well touches on the third one, is loss of current and future customers due to a data breach and or hack. Potential class action lawsuits as well can occur within this personally identifiable information. So if you're hit during 2017 per se, a former customer could potentially, and seen payout in 2017, a former customer could be worried and come after essentially in those areas for a potential class action lawsuit within that area. And touching on one more example as well is potential federal and regulatory fines. And these fines can vary from very small to all the way up to very large in terms of the claims. And touching on that leading in, I'm going to ask Ash to come in and give a real-life claims example for a personally identifiable information kind of breach. So Ash?
Thank you very much, Nick, and hi everyone. Thanks for joining. So these are the type of breaches that we see fairly often. They're normally commonly known as W-2 frauds. So basically, this is whereby someone impersonates a particular policyholder's CEO by setting up a very similar email address, either by adding or taking away a particular letter. So to the, if you quickly have a quick look at the email address, it looks like it's coming from the legitimate email account. So then the fraudsters then email an employee within the policyholder's HR department and request that they send copies of all the W-2 forms pertaining to all of their employees to them for a particular project or a review or something along those lines. Unfortunately, in this situation, I'm referring to the employee who received the request didn't notice that the email address was actually incorrect, and believing that the request had come from their legitimate CEO, they forwarded 250 W-2s to the fraudsters. The next day, the employee followed up with the CEO to ensure that the W-2s had been safely received, and it was then discovered that the request was fraudulent and there'd been a breach of PII, specifically W-2s. And as you all know, that's your name, address, social security number, etc. So upon notification to us, we immediately got in contact with our panel breach counsel, who worked very closely with this particular policyholder and ourselves to handle the incident. Following a review of the data which we know had been compromised, i.e. the 250 W-2s, we were able to ascertain that the insured did have a legal obligation to notify every one of those employees. So following our breach counsel drafting up those suitable notification letters to ensure that they comply with state law, they were sent out via first class mail, and also because social security numbers were breached, we did provide credit monitoring as well. In addition to that, we also advised within the letter, we advised the affected employees to contact the IRS and advise them so they could put a flag on their file, as well as potentially putting a credit freeze on their bank account. So you may have seen reference to this in light of the recent Equifax breach. So these are just precautionary measures to avoid your identity being used to take out credit fraudulently. So due to our early involvement in this and the cooperation of this particular policyholder, we were able to limit the cost to $30,000. Whilst this doesn't sound too sizable amount, had this policyholder not had the cyber insurance policy as they did, this would have most definitely had a significant effect on their bottom line. We tend to see a spike in these type of instances around tax return time for obvious reasons. The criminals can use the information that's within the W-2s to file fraudulent tax returns, and then it's only when the real person that tries to legitimately file their tax returns is told a tax return has already been filed in their name, and then it comes to light. So we see these fairly often throughout the year, but the majority of them come around tax return time.
Thank you, Ash. The next part of exposed information that I'm going to kind of go over, and then Ash will similarly bring a real-life claims example within this as well, is PCI. PCI is payment card information. So essentially, the payment card industry has kind of three kind of core exposures, as you can see on the left part of the screen. Right there is the card reissuing costs. So when said breach occurs, you have to notify just similarly when you have to get a new credit card when you've been breached in terms of that area. There's an allocated cost essentially within that card reissuance to issue that and send you a new card to each affected individual within that area. They vary anywhere depending on the credit card company from $3 all the way up to $10, depending on the credit card information as well. So that's one cost that can go. Number two can be the fraud. Different policies will cover the percentage that is paid essentially when said credit card information is stolen. When said credit card is stolen and then spent elsewhere, the percentage of that cost has to be covered by someone as well, and typically the credit card company essentially will pay that up front, and then sometimes will push back on the said merchant as well, third-party merchant. The PCI fine and penalty, essentially, if an insured is affected with a security breach from their POS systems or credit card information as well. As you can see there, from that side of things, is the fine, depending on how vulnerable and the issues with your system in terms of that. We've seen fines anywhere that can range from $5,000 all the way up to $500,000 that has to be paid net, essentially, if you don't have any cybersecurity policy in place within those individuals as well. Some additional consequences that come with this as well is it's between a $50 to $90 fine per cardholder for that data compromised as well. The suspension of the insured's credit card acceptance, for that matter, for the account provider, so you're unable in this case to take donations on your website within that area when you have been hit with a breach within that area as well. So they have to put that off essentially, and that not only hurts your bottom line in the donation side of things, it really what it hurts is as well as it hurts the customers from that side of things because it inconveniences them as well. And that's touching on the lost reputation with these customers, suppliers, and partners. As I mentioned previously on previous slide as well, there can be possible civil litigation as well from the breach customers, and then this can be loss of customer trust, which affects future sales and or donations for your customers for that matter, and or donors for that matter as well. So touching on a little bit more, obviously it can vary on the credit card company and the contracts that are in place, but what we see typically in these areas is typically the contracts that are written with the third party, in this case it is the credit card companies, would love to push back on the said merchant within those areas. Now Ash will come in and bring a real life claims example for this payment card information as well. So Ash, I'll leave it to you.
Perfect, thanks Nick. So just following on from one of the comments Nick just said about donations, given today's technologies and the way donations are taken, I'm sure this particular example may well relate to some of the companies that are on the call today. Hope not, but it may well do. So in this situation, we had a particular policyholder who takes donations online and therefore collects and stores card information. They received correspondence from one of the card brands, which in this case was Visa, and the correspondence was a common point of purchase notification. So in essence, what that is Visa advising that they've run algorithms throughout their system and that they have identified that a number of compromised bank accounts cards had been used at some point during a 3-month window on this particular policyholder's website. And due to that, they believed that it was that policyholder's system or a website which was the source of the breach. So in line with the policyholder's contractual obligations, they had to pay for a PCI, it's a payment card industry, PFI, forensic investigation to take place. The goal of which is to identify the period of time the policyholder system was at risk and the number of cards and transactions that were taken and processed throughout that period of time. Once we were notified of this particular incident, we got on the phone straight away with the insured and got them in contact with one of our panel expert providers, who is an accredited PFI investigator. On the PCI website, there is a list of investigators that are accredited to carry out a PFI investigation, because in essence, they are providing this for the banks rather than the policyholder themselves. So luckily, this particular panel expert was able to jump on the instruction immediately, and that's very important because these banks put very tight timelines around how long and how quickly a PFI needs to be conducted. So in this particular incident, the PFI investigation concluded that the window of compromise, the at-risk window, was in fact 5 months, not 3 months. So it was another 2 months on top of what Visa had actually thought. And unfortunately, the investigation discovered that 90,000 individual card information had been compromised in this particular breach. So as per the previous incident I just touched upon, we we engaged our panel breach counsel, who immediately started to draft up the notification letters. In this particular situation, it was a little bit different because there were different states involved, and each different state has a slightly different template per the notification letters that they wished the compromised company to send out. So this took a little bit longer and additional costs were incurred, but it was essential to get that legal advice because they are the experts, being able to advise exactly what needs to be in those notification letters per state. In addition to notification letters, we also set up a call centre to field any queries, which, as you can imagine, individuals whose card information has been breached, they are probably worried initially when they receive this letter, and they invariably have questions that they want answered. So that's one of the reasons why we set up a call centre, and also we provided ID theft protection services. What that is a mechanism whereby the affected individual will be guided through the process of putting them back in the position they were prior to the incident. So this involves situations whereby a particular individual has suffered some form of identity fraud. Someone's taken out a bank account in their name or tried to apply for a loan, etc. And as I say, this service is experts which guide the insured through the process of speaking with their bank, speaking with whatever financial institution they may need to resolve the problem and put that particular individual back into the position they were prior to the breach. As we do in all instances, we consider all types of post-breach services that are suitable for that particular incident. In this situation, because there were no social security numbers breached, it was purely card information, we did not see the need for credit monitoring because it really isn't beneficial in these circumstances. I think there's a common misconception that credit monitoring should be provided at all times, regardless of the nature of the breach and what information has actually been compromised. We feel that the credit monitoring is really only beneficial when there's social security numbers that have been breached, because what credit monitoring does in essence is it reviews your credit reports and it reviews your credit score, etc., to see if someone's taken out credit. A lot of the time you will need a social security number to take out a loan, for example, or something of that nature. But in this situation, due to the number of cards and the number of individuals that were affected by this particular breach, the costs were fairly significant. They came in at just under $700,000. That was a split of around $200,000 for legal, notification, call centre and ID theft protection services. A fairly flat fee of $12,000 for the PFI investigation. But the main part of this claim and the costs associated with it were the banks, as Nick mentioned previously. They passed the cost of reissuing every card. So you had 90,000 cards, and in this situation it was $5 each, and that was $450,000 already. And in addition, there was a Visa case management fee, so that's a nominal fee that they put on just because they've had to deal with this particular incident. Luckily, in this situation, although this did occur, the Visa review looked at the PFI investigation and was satisfied that the particular policyholder did have significant and good security measures in place, so that there wasn't a fine. But had there been a fine, it would have been quite substantial given the amount of data that was compromised. So back over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Ash. And touching on the last piece, as I mentioned earlier, this is PHI, which is Protected Health Information. This is really geared towards healthcare industry and nonprofits in this area, but everyone kind of holds some sort of health information, whether you're supplying health insurance for your employees per se as well. So I just wanted to touch on this as well. So touching on the first this is a federal regulation, and on this side, so the office is run by the Office of Civil Rights, which is, in short, you'll see is OCR. This can be fined. These fines can anywhere be per lost record, as I'm mentioning here, is $100 all the way up to $50,000 per lost record. So as I mentioned here, the per lost record can be fined up to a max of $1.5 million. Now, what I want to mention in terms of this side of things on the which is aware on this side of things, because $1.5 million, this number can actually be bigger, larger, because you may also backdate negligent payments charging up to per year, as I mentioned there, $1.5 million within those areas as well. So those numbers can jump significantly, and similar to the PCI side where you saw the fines can be anywhere between $5,000 all the way up to $500,000. In this case, for a per loss record, in terms of this, and that's one individual within this area as well. So can be anywhere from $100 all the way up to $50,000, depending on the fee essentially allocated and what record essentially within that. If there's a social security number within that, obviously it could cost more, or if there's just a name in terms of that, it could be less, but there is a cost allocated to that as well. And as I mentioned here as well, so there's from a state side regulation, it varies by state, but in this case I wanted to give an example for California state regulation as well. The Confidentiality of Medical Information Act, which is CMI, it states that any person can collect $1,000 per person essentially allocated to that with no proof of damage required. This is kind of where these class action lawsuits can come into play within these areas, and specifically in California, there are class action lawyers that just set themselves up to collect this $1,000 fee in the event that they find out that a breach occurs with the organization that's related with a hospital. So common hack attacks. Obviously, it's been in the news quite significantly in terms of these, with two that you've kind of seen mostly that I'm going to touch on briefly on this, and then Ash will be able to give examples on each kind of specific within that area as well. Social engineering. So in terms of this, this is kind of CEO fraud, essentially. When a senior level executive gets tricked into sending you get a trick in your email that says, please wire, call it $25,000, you've paid 75%, here, wire the last 25% of this fund. Everything looks the same, the bank account looks the same, everything along those lines, you wire that out without making that phone call in terms of those areas. That dollar value can go right out, and this is called social engineering, otherwise known as cybercrime within this area as well. So as I mentioned here as a quote, it's gaining unauthorized information by deception, including fraudulent activities meant to gain access to sensitive information or materials. This is more dollar value aspect within this area always, and it can range anywhere from $100 all the way up to, we've seen claims all the way up to $500,000 within this area as well, even more depending on what it is in this area as well. But as I mentioned at the bottom, the targets here are really the decision makers, so the C-suite decision makers, employees as well that pass it on to the said decision maker, whether it be a CFO, CEO, or head accountant within this area that handles funds going out within this area. Now, Ash will touch on an example within the industry, essentially, that has been social engineering. So, Ash, take it from here.
Thank you very much. Yeah, this type of claim is rapidly becoming more and more common, unfortunately. If what we're seeing is it's very easy to carry out if you're in the know, and it can be very, very lucrative for minimal amount of work. So in this particular situation, a policyholder, so an employee within the finance department, received an email from someone purporting to be from a legitimate vendor of that particular policyholder who provided them with IT support. The fraudster appeared to have emailed from the vendor's legitimate account and was chasing payment of an invoice that was outstanding. When they were chasing, the fraudsters actually requested that payment be made to a different bank account to that the policyholder had normally made payments to. Unfortunately, without asking any questions or checking, the policyholder and the employee followed the instructions and made payment to the now known fraudulent bank account. When they were contacted by the quote real vendor a couple of days later, chasing up the invoice, it was then discovered that the funds 2 days prior had actually been sent to a fraudulent bank account. Unfortunately, the policyholder's bank were unable to recover the funds. The funds had already left their bank by the time they'd got in contact, and unfortunately the funds had been taken out, drained from the receiving bank account to the fraudster's bank account, so there's really no way of recovering those funds. Luckily for this particular client, there was a policy in place, and the end payment under this was $86,000, which was the amount of the fraudulent payment request that they had received. What we feel in these situations is, following incidents such as this, we try and assist from a risk management perspective, because we feel that can really help avoid and at least mitigate these particular incidents going forward. So in this particular instance, we had a conversation with the particular policyholder and reviewed their processes and procedures with respect to how they receive and process payment requests. And during those conversations, it was evident that unfortunately they didn't have two particular processes that would have avoided a situation such as this occurring. Those two processes were having dual signatures for all payments over a certain amount of money. So we normally, the amount of the payment can differ depending on the size of the company, but in this situation we would have recommended around the £50,000 mark or $50,000 mark, and the second process would have been for the policyholder to phone a trusted number of that particular vendor once they received a request to pay a different bank account, just to make sure that the bank account details that they were being given were legit and it was correct. Had both of those processes been followed, then this policyholder wouldn't have had this particular incident. So, as I say, I think we try to assist the insurer the best we can from a risk management perspective, because ultimately the social engineering is a hacking of an individual opposed to the hacking of a computer system or a database or something like that. So I think it comes down to education and just making the employees aware that these type of incidents are out there. And I don't think it's if you're going to get one of these now, it's probably more likely when. So back over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Ash. And as Ash, I can touch on, we're seeing more and more with this side of things in terms of social engineering, which also can be worded as cybercrime on a policy. Just make sure when looking through the policy, you make sure you're asking your broker essentially what the cybercrime is buying, and included in terms of this, in terms of the limits within this area. Because as you saw from this side, there was a $86,000 loss within there. If you didn't have those policies or sublimited, there could have been some out-of-pocket costs within that area as well. So thanks for touching that, Ash. Next is ransomware. We saw a lot on the news as well this year, with specifically with the WannaCry and or Petya within these ransomware areas in the news as well. So these are essentially links and emails that will take your system down within this area, whether and on the left here, you have kind of an example, which on the next slide I will touch on another kind of example. They're getting trickier. The hackers are getting trickier and trickier in terms of trying to trick the individuals from this side. And I know Ash has probably experienced as well. A lot of these claims come just from human error, and from an underwriting and a perspective, it's tough to. There's always going to be someone that can potentially be tricked within these areas because they look so real. Within these examples as well. So it can be anywhere from a link in the system. So once you click that link, this is the extortion / ransom, and you're hoping that these policies are, your policy is covering this, hopefully at full limits within these, because these losses can add up significantly, which Ash will touch on in a minute after I go over the next slide and another example within this area as well. So this is another kind of ransomware email link for this matter. So we get these a lot. If anyone has kind of an Amazon account within this area, you get these account status notifications within this. So in this case, it said your online access will be blocked if this issue is not resolved immediately. There you click that link. It looks pretty good from that side of things. I mean, you have everything along those, and you have Amazon.com, and then all of a sudden you click that link, you realize it's not taking you to an Amazon website, and then all of a sudden you're hit with a fee essentially within that area that they ask to unlock your systems. And Ash will touch on the more than just that side of things. The example of just paying that one claim, that's not the only loss that essentially can come up within this side of things, and Ash will touch on in a minute within this. So they're getting trickier and trickier within these ransomware attacks in terms of going after the human side of things within these emails as well. So with that, Ash will give you an example of a ransomware attack that has occurred to a nonprofit. Ash?
Perfect, thank you. I think these type of instances just show very well that these any particular company, any line of business are vulnerable to these type of attacks. So these normally happen over a weekend or a long weekend or a bank holiday or some form of holiday period, because that then maximises the impact on the affected company. So this particular incident that I'm going to refer to, it was a policyholder which tried to log into their database and their system as they would normally, first thing on a Monday morning, and they had discovered that all of their computer systems, files, etc. were encrypted. They couldn't do anything. In fact, they were completely stuck, and their systems were completely down and they could not operate. So during the internal IT department's investigation, they came across a file within one of the databases which, when opened, it demanded a ransom in the amount of 5 Bitcoin, which at that point in time was the equivalent to circa $24,000 to decrypt the files. The policyholder got in contact with us immediately, alongside the claims team as well as our incident response team that sits within the CFC claims team. We carried out some research into the Bitcoin account which the hackers had asked the payment to be made to. Having done that research, it was a joint decision not to pay the ransom. And the main reason behind that was that the particular hackers were using one Bitcoin account for every attack that they were taking place. So had the policyholder paid the ransom, there'd be no way for the hackers to validate that they had actually paid the ransom, and it would have been very unlikely that they would have been given the key in any event. So we decided to go down the restoration route, and we engaged one of our panel IT expert partners, who, together with the assistance of a number of the policyholders' employees, were fortunately able to recover the majority of the policyholders' data from old redundant backups and paper files. That's not to say that there were, I think there was about 7 to 14 days worth of data that was lost, but the majority of the policyholders' data was restored. In this situation, given our early involvement and the assistance of our panel providers, we were able to limit the costs to $47,500, which is still a lot of money, but in this particular situation, because we were involved early and we were able to control the costs, that was $37,500 to the expert partner, which given the amount of data that was involved here and the amount of work that had to be carried out to restore, that was a good and reasonable amount of money. And the other $10,000 was with respect to overtime cost paid to the employee. In this particular situation, there wasn't a business interruption claim as such, because the particular policyholder didn't suffer a reduction in profit or a loss of income as such. For many not-for-profit other companies, not-for-profit companies, they will suffer loss of income and reduction in profit, and there is cover for those losses under the BI business interruption section of policies. Following this claim, we had a debrief with the policyholder, and we spoke to them with respect to how they could either avoid or at least mitigate a situation like this happening in the future. And one of our recommendations was that they should have a penetration testing carried out once every 12 months. This is whereby an external forensic company will try deliberately to gain access to the policyholder systems and databases, thereby highlighting any vulnerabilities that were there, and then the policyholder can take immediate action to close those vulnerabilities. And another recommendation of ours was to increase the level of antivirus software that they had on their system, because the way this came in, the attack vector for this particular incident was a phishing email with an attachment very much like the Amazon email that you're seeing on your screen now. So yeah, these are the type of claims that really can affect anyone, and the costs can quickly spiral out of control. So unfortunately, that's just the way these type of claims are going. Back to you, Nick.
Thank you, Ash. So now we've given some good examples in terms of this area. So now from the policy side of things, that we want to recommend essentially what you should be looking for your proper and implementing the proper cyber coverage within this area. So traditional cyber coverage in the past is really had been a third-party cover, and as I said, had been a third, so that past tense, which is security liability and privacy liability. So essentially, think a hack essentially is passed along to your third-party client side of things. It takes down their systems and provides some financial loss. That's where cyber originated in that area. But what really makes a good cyber policy from a bad cyber policy essentially is really in those first-party covers, and we've touched on a lot of this in these in earlier slides within these areas, touching on IT and forensics and security, cyber threats and extortion, that cyber crime, which is in other words, as I mentioned earlier, is that identity theft and/or social engineering, business interruption. So essentially, what we didn't touch on a whole lot on this business interruption side of things is if you're offline, essentially unable to take donations per se within that area. Basically, in this side of thing, if you're off for 3 days or a week, said for those, and you're unable to take that, that's lost business essentially, or donations for nonprofit side of things that you were unable to take during that week. So essentially, our policy for a cyber triggered event should cover this, and typically you want this at full limits, not sublimited to a smaller area as well. I touched on reputational harm, so essentially when it said cyber breach occurs within this area, essentially this affects the future sales of the company or donations of the company from a customer side of things. They don't feel comfortable essentially because they previously have been hit. Notification costs, within that, we touched on that. There's a dollar value allocated to each notification. Credit monitoring within that as well. Legal and regulatory. This is where an area on a policy that you really want to make sure that you have full limits within this regulatory, because as you saw, it can be anywhere from a very small dollar value from a fine perspective all the way up to, from the regulatory side, all the way up to $500,000 for PCI within those areas as well. And then touching on one more is public relations costs. So drafting the note essentially to help your brand essentially get back and say, you've been hit with a breach within this, this is what we're doing in these aspects as well. So just making sure that you really have those full, those first party limits, which have been more and more the claims that have been rolling in, as Ash touched on earlier in those examples, what we've seen more and more. So this is the more important side of the cover, the most important side of cover that you want to be covered in terms of your cyber policy as well. And I'm going to touch on in the next couple slides a couple of those first party in more detail. Ash touched on earlier as well in terms of the claims example, the cost allocated when a breach occurs. Essentially, you have to bring in a forensic expert and to really diagnose the issue as the question of, has my business been hacked? If the systems have been breached in any way or possible, a typical cyber policy should and will pay for the best forensic experts in the business. And typically what we've seen from an hourly rate side of things, so if you're not covered in this policy, it potentially could be net to bring these in, is about $350 an hour. It's a great business to be in right now, and we see those costs going up quite significantly within this area. And what these forensic experts do is, one, get the systems back up and running to what they previously were. They repair and restore lost, corrupt, and/or stolen data. The last is patch the security hole penetrated by the third-party hacker within these areas as well. So you see a lot of the claims that have come in terms of these is just that a security patch hadn't been updated to a certain, so it left those hackers to get into those areas. Now, please note, and I wanted to touch on the CFC side of things, is forensic teams should be kept on a 3 days. Essentially, it can come out to an average of $25,000 out-of-pocket costs, because they're going to charge that hourly rate until they diagnose that issue within that area. So those dollars can add up very significantly within those areas as well. One more, two more after this, but legal and PR costs. So the real question is, was information stolen? If the forensic expert finds out that this information is and was stolen, a cyber policy should pay for the following parties: public relations costs. Within this, what we see in this area, what we've seen from the marketplace is anywhere in that range of $200 an hour can range, but to advise the insured, say for 10 hours within this to diagnose that issue, that can be a $2,000 out-of-pocket cost. Now that number can seem very insignificant within this, but just think the numbers just adding up for all the other losses that come in. data breach attorneys, as well as anywhere in that 350 range per hour for legal advice on the federal, the state, and the private privacy rules and regulation. As you saw earlier from that side of things, from Ash's examples, they were different, obviously, from the federal and the state side of things, from a notification on the state level that goes and allocated within that. A conservative breach typically would have about 10 plus hours clocked at $3,500 at a pocket cost within that. So these hours obviously will increase depending on what and how much information was stolen. Touching on a little bit more, here's an example of each type of the regulatory bodies. From the federal side of things, as I touched on earlier, the federal side of things from medical records is the OCR. They can be anywhere up to a max of $1.5 million at up to $55,000 per lost record. On the state side of things, if the personally identifiable information is stolen, these notification costs can range anywhere from $1 to $3. And on the private side, if credit cards numbers are stolen within this, you can be fined, as I mentioned, up to $500,000. But one more example on that is the dollar value allocated that the credit card company pushes back on that example as well. Was information stolen? So according to state laws, a business that uses a third-party processor, this is where that they is still considered the data owner, the insured. In this case, it would be the nonprofits. In this side of things, you are the data owner in terms of this, and they can push it back once they've paid in these examples as well. Touching on business interruption and reputational harm, I touched on this as well. As you can see, there's just increased side of things, but these are where we're seeing a lot of the claims. If systems go down, a cyber policy should cover the lost revenue from the business downtime and this lost customers, which touched on the business interruption is that business downtime, so you're unable to take donations within this area as well. So you want your cyber policy to cover that, and they can add up very quickly depending on how big or small your business is. And the reputational harm piece within that as well, the issues that come when you are breached within this area as well. They may take their business elsewhere because they don't feel comfortable because they potentially could be exposed. Last but not least, in terms of this ammo, is the cyber crime, which is that social engineering. So what if bank account, the question is, what if bank accounts or payment details are compromised? A cyber policy should and will pay for this wire transfer fraud on a commercial level and a personal level, hopefully, in terms of those areas as well. Our policy covers the personal with the commercial as well. So the social engineering piece is, as Ash touched on earlier, is hackers will pose as a CEO, CFO, and then wire funds to a third party's fake bank account within this area as well. These are typically anywhere from thousands of dollars all the way up to, we've seen significant hundreds of thousands of dollars within this area. And that is the same for the personal funds transfer fraud as well. So with that, I will leave it on to Wendy Caruso and open it up to question and answers. Wendy?
Thanks, Nick and Ash. I had a few questions coming through here. The first one is, can you explain what Bitcoin is and how it works in the event of a breach?
Sure. So a type of Bitcoin is essentially a type of digital currency in which encryption techniques used to regulate normally a bank and wire transfers, essentially. They operate independently of a central bank, so it's completely anonymous. And as Ash touched on in terms of the example, you can't track it back to a certain area in terms of those areas as well. And you want, if your policy, you want your claims team to have, if it is decided that the ransom is to be paid, you want your claims team, which CFC has, we have the relationship with specialist vendors who can assist with the process of buying that Bitcoin and transferring it back to the hackers as well. Ash, do you have anything else to touch on in terms of the Bitcoin?
No, I think that's covered it. Yeah, it's completely anonymous, and as I mentioned previously, you can sometimes track it back to a particular Bitcoin account or wallet, but that's where it stops. Really, it is really difficult to find who owns that because the whole idea of Bitcoin is to be anonymous. So, and yeah, as Nick just touched upon, if we have situations where a ransom needs to be paid, given that it's not a day-to-day process of buying Bitcoins and transferring Bitcoins, we do have those relationships with specialist partners and experts who can assist through that process.
Thank you, Ash.
Thanks. Nick, somebody else had a question on how to decide what the limits of insurance should be. You know, what types of things do they need to concentrate on to decide that level?
Yep, absolutely. So on this question as well, I mean, it's a difficult question to answer in terms of recommending the certain limits. So your hope from this, because it can potentially come out to an E&O claim if you recommend $1 million and all of a sudden there's a $3 million loss in terms of this area as well. But in terms of options, you want to provide options within this area. Essentially what we see in the marketplace in terms of how high these limits, unless they're required by a contract, typically these is just you supply these options within this area on what the requirement is, and then you just work through from that. New buyers are essentially buying the lowest limits in terms of offered in terms of these areas, and then you can always work your way up as opposed to buying the most limits at the most expensive and then having to essentially buy down. It's a tough question to answer and recommending how high those limits are going, just because you don't want to offer one and all of a sudden we've seen E&O claims pop in where they get hit with a $3 million loss. So a good example could be the Equifax, because they had 150 mil in limits. They're going to blow right through that in terms of those areas. So it's a difficult question to answer in terms of that specifically within that area. But you're hoping that you're provided as an insured and a business owner with options essentially to walk through.
Thanks. Another question just came up that I know I'm asked about a lot. If they have an IT department or if IT is outsourced, why would an organization need their own cyber policy if they're breached?
Sure, absolutely. We touched on a little bit during the meeting as well in terms of this, and basically the insured will typically have a policy in place and the third party will have a policy in place. But given the data originates with the insured and the business owner, that the policyholder, those contracts that we've seen are typically written in favor of the third party to push back that liability onto the original policyholder, typically in terms of that. So, and touching on a little bit more, also the policyholder who collects and stores the data will be classified as the quote data owner. So that's the origination side of things. And then they have legal, as the business owner, you have legal requirements to notify in the first instant in that capacity as well. So really what we see is basically, I mean, if it was that simple from that side, you could just, the third party side, you could just push on the third party and they'd have to buy a lot of limits within those areas. So it can be shared liability within that area, but you're hoping, typically what we've seen in those contracts, they're written in favor of the third party to push it back on the merchant as well. And if you don't have a cyber policy in place within that area, you're going to have to take it net, or you're hoping that your cyber policy responds.
Okay, another one just came in. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I do apologise. I'm just going to add that if the IT was outsourced, for their policy to respond, you'd probably have to prove some form of negligence on behalf of the IT provider. As has been seen in a couple of these examples, it's unfortunately an employee clicking on a link or being duped into making a payment. There's been no real negligence on behalf of the IT provider, so I just think that's probably worth bearing in mind as well.
Great, thanks. Somebody else was curious. They've asked, when a system is breached, how do you know who was potentially impacted and how many people were potentially impacted? You know, in order to know who you need to provide credit monitoring and notification to.
Absolutely. So Ash touched on this a little bit during the claims examples as well. So this is essentially the job of the forensic firm and the forensic accountant in which they are engaged to this. So they will work to confirm which sections of the said data breach or database and server were hit and what data has been accessed, which determines who needs to be notified in this as well. So in this case, it is beneficial. It's really only beneficial when the social security numbers have been breached within this area. that essentially can be the dollar value insurance. But in terms of the notification costs that are allocated, it really is who's been accessed, what part of the database has been hit, and these forensic accountants work with the IT department in terms of this and can work within that to notify what is needed essentially from notification side of things. And as Ash pointed out in one of his claims examples, they believe that they didn't need to use credit monitoring after the credit forensic analyst was into that area as well. So there was no cost allocated to that side of things. So really it comes down to the forensic accountant and the incident response team within that, and the vendors allocated within that area as well. So Ash, do you have anything else to add on that?
No, I think you covered it. As you said, it's really the role of the forensic firm which is engaged, and that's why it's important to get forensic firms involved as soon as possible. They will preserve the database to enable them to carry out their investigation. I had a recent claim whereby the IT department had a particular data breach and unfortunately wiped the system and restored so they could get back working again. But by doing so, they didn't keep copies of logs, etc. So the forensic investigation was very, very limited, and in a situation where we could have avoided notifying 50,000 individuals, because we couldn't prove that the data wasn't accessed, we had to notify 50,000 individuals at a substantial cost. So no, it's very important to get these forensic firms in as soon as possible to preserve the system, and also to sort of close any back doors or holes and ensure that the hackers are no longer in the system.
Okay, I'm going to flip this back over to Dina right now. Those are all the questions that I have on my screen. Nick and Ash, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. That was really great information. Before you exit the webinar, please take a moment to download our Cyber Risk Insurance Resource Guide for Nonprofits, and that's from the green widget at the bottom of your screen. We'd also ask that you please complete the brief questionnaire that appears so we can address any feedback that you have for us. Again, we'll send out the presentation slides and the recording to all attendees by tomorrow afternoon. To see how your organization can stay protected if hit by a cyber attack, contact Jim Gow at Corporate Synergies. Thanks for your attention, and please enjoy the rest of your day.